emerging, which is unrolling in front of us now.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow the Noble Lord, the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, and to very much agree with his expressions of concern about our current family migration policies. I'm sure the government would like to claim to be the party of the family, and yet we have migration policies that regularly, continually separate both refugees and other families at a huge scale, and that's something that one would hope to see might change in the future. But I want to thank the Noble Lord, Lord Harries of Pentragarth, for securing this important debate. It is a pity that it comes at the end of the week when the House is exhausted by a deluge of government legislation, but it does mean that those of us who are here have perhaps a chance to take a broader view than is commonly possible. So I'm going to start with a longue durée perspective, inspired in part by recently listening to the University of Georgia academic Kaunya Ramnath, author of a book titled Boats in a Storm, Law, Migration and Decolonisation in South and Southeast Asia, 1942 to 1962. It recounts how people from what are now India, Burma, Sri Lanka and Malaysia, who had traditionally moved freely around the Indian Ocean, were suddenly trapped, families divided, trade routes disrupted by the imposition of the idea, imported from Europe, of the rigid Westphalian system of states. All of this is within living memory of a change from freedom to restriction to great suffering inflicted by borders. It's a useful reminder that freedom of movement for nearly all of human history has been the normal condition. Our current rigidity is, on the global scale, an extremely recent development. We can all enjoy reading the travel narratives of Ibn Battuta or Marco Polo, and none of them really talk about significant border issues or certainly immigration issues at all. And this rigidity, we really have to ask the question, is it going to be fit for this age of shocks, of the climate emergency, the desperate urgency of which has been driven home to us again and again this year, as the El Niño weather system has magnified the boiling of our world? Clearly, the rigidity is now a huge problem. As the people of the Libyan city of Derna, which formerly had a population of around 100,000, have so tragically been subject to this week, perhaps 20,000 people have been swept to their deaths. One description speaking of a 7-metre-high wall of water surging along a valley in the city, gouging out whole neighbourhoods. That's a powerful, tragic and little-covered reminder of a truth driven home to me a few years ago by a Women's Environmental Network event on climate migration, which stressed that while much of the debate around climate migration is how do we stop it, the reality is, for many, the inability to move, to migrate, is literally a death sentence. Being trapped in a place that is literally unsurvivable is as much of a problem as being forced to move. Indeed, of course, potentially a greater problem. That's not to say, of course, that the world must not do everything it can to mitigate the climate emissions, to reduce the scale of the coming disaster. But as so many have experienced this year, there's already a great deal of disaster built in. Now, the Green Party position is absolutely clear. We want to create a world in which no one is forced to move by the climate emergency or by other human-inflicted disaster, including war and conflict. We have the political vision to see that this is possible. But we also want a world in which people are free to move when they want. As a migrant who's lived on 3 continents, I've had the privilege of my place of birth, a place stolen from its original inhabitants in hideous acts of genocide by incoming migrants that were my predecessors. That made it easy for me. We must work towards a world where everyone who wants to has the same freedom as I have personally been lucky enough to enjoy. But in the meantime, we have huge numbers of people trapped, dying at borders, increasingly fortified to keep them out, from the charnel house of the Med to the desperate badlands of Mexico adjoining the US border, and indeed across the US border in states like Arizona. Figures from the first half of this year show 11 children die every week attempting to cross the Mediterranean. Those are figures from the UN. And they came out just a month after an estimated 100 children died when a fishing boat sank off southern Greece. The fact is that we should be putting significant pressure on the European Union to acknowledge the horrors that Fortress Europe, its policy, has created, and to see a situation that provides an orderly, safe route for people to seek sanctuary. And I'm very proud that the European Green Party has been an absolute leader in fighting back against Fortress Europe and in promoting orderly, safe, just policies. Now, I think it's worth focusing a little on how the climate emergency interacts with and magnifies or causes even conflict. And I think there's a case study of Somalia where there have been 6 failed rainy seasons in a row, which has led to 3 years of insufficient water and food insecurity. Since the middle of 2021, a third of all the livestock in Somalia has died. 20% of its people are displaced, many of them heading to refugee camps in Kenya and Ethiopia. Each week, 2,000 people from Somalia arrive at the Dadaab refugee camp alone. Now, some people in the UK like to talk about our alleged small boat crisis, which saw in the first half of this year 11,500 people arriving across the Channel because there are not safe, orderly routes available to them. That amounts to 6 weeks of arrivals at one refugee camp in Kenya. The fact is that most refugees are either internally displaced in their own countries or are in neighbouring countries which are massively racked by poverty and inequality and a global system which still sucks resources out of the global south into the global north. And I note that this morning your Lordship's House was discussing the Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary's speech in Africa, which included, I was pleased to note, a reference to the need to reform the international financial sector, which of course is still, we look at the issues of debt, pumping huge amounts of money out of the global south into, down the road, the City of London, and that is leaving people with no choice but to become refugees. And of course, in this context, I cannot avoid mentioning the cuts to overseas development assistance and to the official development assistance and the diversion of funds to be spent here in the UK instead of for the proper purpose. Now, Noble Lord Harries gave us many of the figures and set much of the scale of this, but I think it is worth focusing on the fact that we have people, particularly on the benches opposite, who like to attack the idea of net zero by 2050. Of course, what we should be looking at is by net zero for the UK by 2030, or in the early 2030s at the absolute latest. But if that is not taken, if the climate mitigation measures are not taken, you are looking at a world of climate refugees. So we see that a sort of middle level estimates say 216 million people could be forced to move within their own countries by 2050, but it could be an 80% reduction in that if the world, that is primarily the global north, does what it needs to do now on climate. These estimates range from 25 million to 1.5 billion people being climate refugees. And my lords, I would ask every person who questions climate action in the UK to consider what the impact of failing to act as we are now failing to act adequately on the climate, what that means for that figure of climate refugees.
My Lords, it is a delight to follow the noble lady Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle, and I'm grateful to the noble